Morning, everyone. Happy, at least they've stopped talking about the budget day. And welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's online political editor, Dan Bloom. Now, sorry about this, but we're going to be discussing the budget, specifically the small print, the stuff Rishi Sunak didn't mention yesterday. And once he sat down, journalists got to go through the detail. And so we now know an awful lot more than we did about both what he's giving us, what he's taking away, and what he's not even bothering to make much mention of. Now, if you've got a question about this, tell us how the budget so far has affected you, if you know. If you don't know, ask us and we'll do our best to help. Tell us about your situation with your self-employed, a stay-at-home mum, you're on universal credit, whatever it might be, and let's hear how what Rishi Sunak is offering is going to affect you. Get in the comments and tell us what's happening with you. Now, for example, yesterday, he promised lots of tax freezes, which sound great, don't they? But the Institute of Fiscal Studies today in the Mirror are saying this means he'll be taking £8 billion extra in tax from us over the next few years. So we're not economists. Dan, how does this work? He freezes income tax, and then what happens?
So it's called a stealth tax for a reason. So what the change is to is the personal allowance, the amount you can earn tax-free. And then if you're lucky enough to be a higher rate taxpayer, 40p taxpayer, the level at which that 40p kicks in. So those thresholds have been going up every year. And actually under the Tories and the Lib Dems, they rose by a lot. Now they're going up a tiny, tiny bit this year. So you earn an extra 70 quid without paying tax. That saves you about sort of £12.50 or whatever. But then the year after and all the way up to 2026, they're not going to rise those thresholds. So it means that as your wages, hopefully, go up in the next 5 years or so, the amount of income tax you pay will not, the threshold at which you pay income tax won't move with that. So there'll be more of your wage that goes into income tax than it would have done otherwise. So no one is actually taking money away from you that you have right now. They're depriving you of money that you might have made in the future. And it really creeps up. So it's something like £1.5 billion next year. But then by the time you get to 2026, it's £8 billion a year for the Treasury. So it's a bit like a lot of the austerity measures back in the early 2000s where they froze benefits and public sector pay. Of course, they are freezing public sector pay as well for most people, where you don't actually lose any cash, but you progressively get less well off as time goes on and the price of goods in the supermarket goes up and all that sort of thing.
Right, yeah. So, and this is because it's to do with the prices of things that you buy as well. And it's the people who are on, some are people who are earning below that tax threshold now. If you're earning below about £12,500, you don't pay income tax on that. And if that stays, then if, say, you start earning an extra couple of £100 over the next couple of years, then you do start paying tax. So this is going to be perhaps 1 million or so people who are earning the least, who are going to get taxed proportionally more than they do now. How is that fair or right? I mean, it's regressive. I know governments do it, but it's not fair or right or reasonable, is it?
Well, it's maybe a good time to come on to Rajesh's question, because he's talking about the corporation tax rise. And that is perhaps what Rishi Sunak would say is the progressive element where he's targeting big business. So as Rajesh says, corporation tax going up from 19% to 25%, almost reversing the Tories' cuts to it over the last decade, but not quite. The reason is he needs some money from tax rises, and this will raise an enormous, it's much bigger than anything else in the budget. It will raise something like £17 billion a year by the time it's up and running, kind of towards the next election. However, there are some big problems with this. He's set it up so that only the companies that make the most profits will pay the biggest percentage. But actually, there are some big companies that are very clever with their profits, and they make very, very tiny profits in order to cut down on their tax. So they could kind of slip in under the radar here by saying, oh, well, we didn't make much profit, so we pay the original 19%.
Or they do a Trump and offset debt against things, or move some money out of the jurisdiction. I'm not going to start naming some of those companies, but we're one of the ones that do it. And the small business owners in this country don't or can't do that. and they're the ones who are going to get hit. And that, if they pay more tax, it just means they put up their prices, which means customers end up paying more in the long run anyway.
Well, at the same time, you see, he's also introduced a whole load of tax breaks for business. So there's this very complicated super deduction scheme where firms that invest will get more than 100% of the cost of their investment down off their taxable income, which means basically that they save a whole load off their tax bill. That will actually cost £25 billion over 2 years. It's enormous when you consider the universal credit, which I think is a question down there, is the extension of the £20 is something like £2 billion. It's absolutely enormous giveaway to business. So while there was nothing much, and we'll come on to this later, the budget for sort of NHS funding, new funding, social care, that education, that sort of thing, he's having this huge kind of push and pull with business where he's giving them a whole load now and then he's taking away a whole load in the future.
Right, now keep asking us your questions, everybody, because we do want to know how some of this is affecting you. Now, Elizabeth says, do I get 20 quid more universal credit? And if we do, when does it start? I think you get another 20 quid, Elizabeth. You get the 20 quid extra you've been having up till now, but that's going, and it's going at the same time as the furlough scheme, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, so this is something Rishi Sunak confirmed this morning, is that universal credit was made £20 a week more generous back last April because of coronavirus. That was going to expire the first couple of weeks of next month. That's now been extended to sort of September the 30th-ish. But there were calls to make it permanent, because the whole problem with universal credit is it just wasn't generous enough, is what the charities and all that were saying. Chancellor hasn't really taken that on board. He said it only needs to be more generous at the moment because of the pandemic. So Elizabeth, if you're on universal credit already, you're not getting £20 a week more, you're getting the £20 that you've had since last April continue. And what the Chancellor has said today is that that will end at the end of September. He doesn't want to extend it. And that's a real problem. I mean, some of the small print of the budget today, yesterday, shows that the furlough scheme which is due to end on September 30th, exactly the same time, could still have 2 million people still on it in September, which is pretty shocking kind of projection when you consider that we're meant to be out of lockdown restrictions, as soon as maybe June the 21st at the earliest. So that's a projection from the government's budget watchdog. They haven't explained how they've got to that figure, but it's a little bit of an alarm bell there that they think the economy is not going to have sort of totally recovered by September, and it's going to take until the middle of next year.
Surely if 2 million people are still on furlough after the end of restrictions, if in June we're as back to normal as we can be, perhaps white collar workers still working from home and so on and so forth, but we're as back to normal with the vaccine and everything as we can be by June, then the 2 million that are still on furlough by September, presumably they're on furlough because their jobs just don't really exist anymore. So it come October the 1st, they'll be down the job centre.
Well, that is a potential risk. And if they go down the job centre in October, suddenly they'll find that they don't have quite as much of a level of universal credit to rely on. Universal credit's not being scrapped or anything, it's just be less generous. And this comes on to Mark's question, doesn't it? How is he going to help those out of work? Now, at the moment, you get the higher universal credit if you're out of work, and he's announced a whole load of sort of schemes. It's called Plan for Jobs, is what he calls it, to get people back into jobs. But there have been some false starts on this. So he put out a very expensive looking video this week, the Chancellor, see him there doing his party political broadcast, with all his hoodies for the Kickstart scheme. That was his big scheme to get young people back into job placements and stuff. Sounds like a great scheme. The problem is that with all the COVID restrictions, taking on new people is kind of one of the things that you're not going to be able to do. I think we talked about this in our Facebook Live on Monday, but there were only 2,000 people who'd actually started schemes back in sort of January. So he's got all these schemes up and running. There's all sorts of work coaching things and on virtual seminars and all that sort of thing that the DWP are talking about. The only problem is that, of course, if the jobs aren't there, then there's only so many people that can take the jobs, and that's a mathematical impossibility.
Exactly.
So it's a real tricky one.
Keep asking us your questions. Leanne, self-employed people shouldn't have to wait until the end of April, beginning of May to claim our furlough. We haven't had any personal income since December, been in tier 4. PAYE furlough doesn't have to wait. They're paid monthly as normal. I can't understand how they can justify this. The attitude the government's had towards self-employed people all the way through has been very much self-employed, your problem kind of thing. And they've helped people. Leanne's obviously going to qualify for something, it seems here, to the end of April. But not everyone who's self-employed is qualified. Sole traders usually qualify and not company directors, for example. And if they haven't had work or been paid, for example, since December, then they're really starting to, hurt now. And we're coming up to the time when tax payments are due and things like this. Answer me this, Dan, why has Rishi Sunak taken this attitude towards 5 million self-employed people who are the least cost in the employment system? Don't take holiday, don't take sick pay, don't take maternity leave. And yet we're the ones who have perhaps suffered the most. She said as a self-employed person who feels this quite hard.
I've got lots of self-employed friends who've had exactly the same problems. I think the reason he's done it, and this isn't making any excuses for it, is because with furlough, you've got a consistent paper trail with payroll departments of all these big companies that, they're trying to defraud the furlough scheme. There is a way.
There's my paper trail. There's my paperwork.
That's enormous.
Sunak sees it every year. Sorry, I got my belly out there.
I think the issue with that, what the Treasury would say is that that's your personal paper trail, and then another person has a personal paper trail, and your tax assessments can have lots of different sort of individual circumstances in it. So they introduce these big blanket rules that exclude millions of people from the schemes, like how you have to have been up and running in 2018-19, which now, for the latest one, you can have been up and running in 2019-20, but that still misses some people out. You have to have earned more than half your income from self-employment, which is, unfair to people who have a very fine balance on that. So in terms of Leanne's actual question, why are we having to wait until the end of April, beginning of May? It's because they chose this thing of making it in one-off grants rather than a sort of ongoing benefit. And that's a real problem for people because, cash flow is a huge thing for people who are self-employed.
Yeah, it takes 3 months to get paid.
Yeah, it's just the way they've set it up. It's the architecture of the whole scheme. I think why the answer would simply be that was the easiest way they could see to set up a complicated scheme. But whether it is actually the easiest way, that you probably won't agree.
No, well, Germany's managed to pay self-employed people based upon their earnings on the previous couple of years. So there's no reason that we couldn't. And we could have bailed out people rather than businesses, and then everyone just gets the same, and it would have been an awful lot better. Anyway, William Southey, hello. Asking a question again. Welcome, William. Do key workers get a wage increase? Dan?
Yeah, I can give a short, easy answer to that one. Minimum wage is going up next month, 19p an hour for the over 23s, which is a lot less than it's gone up before. So it'll be £8.91 if you're over 23. The lower, the interesting thing about that is that people who are 23 and 24 years old qualify for the higher rate at the first time. So it used to be that if you're under 25, you would get a lower minimum wage, getting lower and lower until you get down to 16 or apprentices. Now 23 and 24-year-olds apply for that. Now, the one problem with what the question says is key workers. Now, if you're including teachers and other people in the public sector, no, they are not getting a pay rise because they already earn more than the minimum wage and they have sort of public sector salaries. Those are all being frozen in April, apart from for some NHS staff. So, yes, the minimum wage is going up, but if you're talking about key workers like civil servants, council officers, education, I'm afraid you're out of luck.
Yeah, unless you can move into making very expensive wallpaper hangings for Downing Street, in which case, cash in time. Now, Robert asks, why is everyone getting help apart from the elderly who financially haven't had any help? What's happened to pensions? Did he mention pensions yesterday?
So he didn't. Well, he did. I'll come on to that. But he didn't mention pensions going up because that's already been dealt with earlier in the year. So pensions are going up, I think, by 2.5%. But I haven't got the figures in front of me. because they're still protected by the triple lock this year. But there was a bit of a stealth tax raid on pensions, so something called the lifetime allowance, which generally only really affects sort of wealthier pensioners with larger pensions. It is that threshold, just like with income tax, is being frozen up until 2026. So that's another stealth tax raid on sort of the slightly wealthier end of pensioners. It will take £300 million a year from them.
Right. Now keep asking your questions. We do know that the duty on booze and fags is being frozen, which is a great idea in the middle of a public health crisis, of course. And Tricia says here, what's the criteria now to qualify for furlough? I wasn't employed before the 30th of October. I'm not entitled, but I need to work when all my other colleagues are on week after week, or week on, week off. It's a crappy rule. Some lives are not as important as others. Dan, do you know the criteria?
I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. They had extended the cut-off date for furlough to be later, but I'm not sure when the last extension was. And it may be, as Tricia says, it's October the 30th. It may be. Tell you what, I'll check and we'll come back to it.
We'll come back at the end, Tricia. Stay tuned. We'll be there.
Right.
Hello, Rajesh.
She's right. It's 30th of October. I've just looked it up.
Still the 30th.
Which seems a bit odd, but we'll ask the Treasury about that. It's interesting.
Yes, exactly. Now, morning, Rajesh. He didn't even broach the subject of how Brexit will affect the UK economy. He mentioned it twice, didn't he, Dan? He didn't really talk about the fact that the economy is going to shrink by 4% due to it. Also, the total UK government is almost £3 trillion. How are we going to pay for this UK debt?
Yeah, so
I think is the answer.
Well, yeah, I believe the word Brexit was not in the budget at all, in the speech. However, it is definitely in the small print. The budget responsibility forecasts are saying it's going to take a 4% permanent hit to our economy, and I think knock 0.5% off GDP in the first 3 months of this year because of the disruption that we had and the sort of, firms getting used to new paperwork. So that's the first part of the question, isn't it? The thing is that we're looking at the economy as a whole, and he hasn't separated out Brexit. So if it hadn't been for COVID, we'd all be talking about how we're going to pay back this Brexit deficit. As it happens, we're talking about how we're going to pay back this COVID deficit and this Brexit deficit.
All lots one inside the other.
And then the other question, the debt. The debt is enormous, the national debt, and it's going to get bigger. The Chancellor was saying it's going to get larger and larger in the next couple of years because he has to keep borrowing. And then after 3 years, he would start, instead of doing tax giveaways, start taking things back. So it would start to fall again. But we've all heard Tory governments talking about how the debt will fall before, and it has just continued to go up and up and up.
Exactly. Now, are other benefits, says Bexy, going to get any uplift?
No, they are not, and a lot of people are very angry about that. So they will get the sort of annual uprating, which is just a percentage inflation increase, right? But this year, inflation was almost at rock bottom. So things like carers allowance and ESA, the sickness and disability benefit, which is mentioned there, will go up by 35p per week. Don't spend it all at once. Whereas universal credit got the £20 per week. I mean, you can see the enormous difference that charities are furious about this. They say it's a two-tier welfare state, and people on ESA technically now finally can move to universal credit as of very recently, but a lot of them don't want to because they're worried about the various kind of issues with universal credit. And ministers say you should move if you think you'll be better off, but then they also say check that you will be better off because it's not a total guarantee.
This is so complex and it's so aggressive with some of the poorest people suffering very hard at a time when the poorest people are the ones who've been dying in greatest numbers as well. Why on earth didn't they do as they said they were considering at the start of all this last year, and which would have been so much simpler and easier and would have bailed out people? If they'd paid a universal basic income to every adult over the age of 18 in this country, we wouldn't have any of these questions because everyone would have managed to get through it. And then as soon as lockdown eases, the door opens, everyone can go out and spend, the economy is ready to go again. Why didn't they do that? Oh, I know the answer. It's because it's too socialist, isn't it? Anyway, yeah, sorry,
Frank, I mean, I'm not even sure if that one's backed by the Labour Party at the moment. But
I think there was some, not officially, but there were people on the Labour benches calling for it. Boris and Rishi said they were considering it, and then they threw it out the window.
Yeah, John McDonnell was going to trial it, I think, back in the day when he was Shadow Chancellor. But I mean, frankly, they've talked about universal basic income before. They don't like it. They say that it's not an effective way of getting money to people. And that's the nuanced argument. The unnuanced argument is the Tory mayoral candidate in London who said this week that some people would spend it on, and I quote, lots of drugs. So
yes, but it must be pointed out that the black market economy now is calculated inside GDP. So even spending on drugs becomes national wealth. It's all part of the economy.
So I'll take Danny's question. What are the new things about the self-employed grant, and when can people claim it? So there are some changes, but they're a bit hotly disputed. For the first time, you can claim it if you're eligible and you only had a tax return for 2019/20. So before, you had to have been up and running for 2 years. But now that more tax return data has come through from that year, you can claim for that year as well. And so it brings some people who were newly self-employed, who just set up, who weren't qualifying before, into the system. However, Treasury claims it's 600,000 people. All suggestions are that it's not that many people actually, and that's the sort of gross number that might be eligible rather than the number that actually will be. On the fourth grant, you can claim it from next month. And then there will be a fifth grant later in the year with dates to be confirmed, but it's less generous. So the fifth grant will only give you the full amount, which is £7,500 or 80% of your profits, if you can show that you've made losses over a certain amount or your revenue has been reduced by a certain amount during COVID. So there's yet another test to get the fifth grant that wasn't there for the fourth grant and all the ones before. Okay. Will everyone's grant be based on the 2019-20 tax return? Asks 24 Roxy X. I don't know. I'm sorry.
You've only been working, you were part-time before 2019 and is now taking in people who got 2019-20 tax return, then I would say probably.
So I don't want to speak out of turn. I think it was based over historic average monthly profits over kind of a couple of years of tax returns. So I think if you're only basing it on your 2019-20 tax return, then yes, it would only be based on that. But if you have a couple of years back, then potentially it would average out. But I'm not quite sure about that, so I don't want to mislead you.
No, we'll try and find out an answer for you, Roxy. Now, I want to get on, if possible, to talk about one of these things that Karen's mentioned, really. The things that were not in Rishi's budget speech yesterday. There was a few mentions of Brexit in the document released afterwards. There was no mention of social care in the speech. He mentioned 19 million for domestic abuse, but seeing as it costs the state in court, police, hospital, social costs, billions every year, that is a piddling amount. You might as well have not bothered. That's a couple of refugees for a couple of months. Does nothing, 19 million. And Dan, you've written a great roundup today, which we'll post in the comments, about some of the hidden cuts in the budget. NHS spending overall looks like it's going to be cut. And public spending could be cut by 4 billion a year. This is new austerity. He didn't use that word, did he?
Certainly not. And the Treasury have all sorts of kind of explanations and excuses for these figures this morning. So let's take them in turn. The NHS spending, the budget clearly shows that if you're including COVID spending, NHS spending or Department of Health spending, I should say, comes down by something like £30 billion between this year and next year. But the Treasury say that that's because so much has been spent on COVID specifically, and the projection is that NHS spending will still go up, but that if you're including COVID on top, it will come down and sort of meet in the middle somewhere. And what they say is that they can put more funding into COVID if they need to, kind of between budgets. Now, Labour are not very happy about this. Labour are using this as their sort of primary attack point today and saying this is a stealthy cut. It's clearly there in the numbers, and that the Chancellor didn't announce it. So I guess it's a question of who you believe. On the other one, this one's a bit more hotly contested, and actually we're backed up by some of these sort of experts and the think tanks on this so far. The budget clearly says that there would be cuts, uses that word, the budget watchdog, to kind of unprotected Whitehall departments, things like transport, maybe councils, that sort of thing, which have already been slashed under austerity. And those could be something like £4 billion or just under a year. Now, what the Treasury says about that is that some of this is sort of technical accounting language. It's not an actual cut. It's because inflation has changed and the projections have changed rather than it being a real cut. But we do understand that some of that is also tied up with foreign aid cuts and the freeze in public sector wages. So it's a bit of a mixed message coming out here. You know, how much of it is actual cuts and how much of it is them trying to explain it away as this sort of technical accounting language. And you can expect this one to roll on and on because, you know, the IFS, which is respected think tank, is saying, no, it looks like spending on public services will be sort of stripped back a bit.
Yeah, so austerity again. Now, Karen, your question about food banks and a return to Victorian and Dickensian times is very interesting. I want you to hang around because I'm not going to answer it yet. We've got some good news coming up and I want to talk about it then. First, before we do, one last point about the budget. The Green Homes initiatives, there is money that has been given out by government to pay for things like solar panels and insulation funding. That kind of stuff was seeding jobs in the green sector, the environmental sector, which is where lots of people are saying that's where to make the economy grow. It's where Britain should be ahead of the tech and a world leader. And it's where we should be throwing more cash now and investment to get jobs up and running, because the climate crisis is, you know, if you're helping ameliorate that, then your business, your job is going to be very safe and very well paid, and you'll be working worldwide. So there wasn't much mention of how we are going to save the planet in this speech. And in fact, he's got on frozen fuel duty. So we'll all be driving our petrol and diesel cars a little bit further when we're allowed to drive them around again.
Yeah, well, you took the words right out my mouth. I mean, there's two elements of that. Fuel duty, obviously extremely popular with car drivers when you freeze fuel duty, and it keeps fuel prices a little bit lower. Fuel duty is already, you know, half the cost of a tank of petrol. But it's been frozen for more than a decade now. And the cost of the sort of lost money to the taxpayer of not raising that money is in the order of something like almost £1 billion a year for each year that you freeze it. And I mean, you know, money for the public purse does have to come from somewhere. It's a political choice to do that and then to cut something else. For example, you know, universal credit is going to be cut in October. So maybe you have to make a choice, especially when you're proclaiming to be, you know, the greenest government ever. But when you do that, and the Green Homes grant, which Susie mentioned, is a bit of a mystery, because not only was it not in his budget speech, it's not in any of the budget documents. And I think the position at the moment is that this scheme, which sort of gives you £5,000 vouchers to do up your house, and, you know, with eco measures, insulation, solar panels, that sort of thing, the money has been cut back in the coming year compared to what it was this year. And then there's no promise, as far as I know, of money after that. And we were sort of questioning people on this yesterday and couldn't get any answer as to whether there will be any new money. And if it's not announced in the budget, I think we have to assume that there won't be. Yeah. So they're proclaiming to be a great green budget. We're hosting this fantastic climate summit in Glasgow this autumn. But that's a couple of things which show that maybe, you know, as people like Greenpeace are saying, it's kind of not worth the paper it's written on.
Exactly. If you're making a great political choice about being green, perhaps you would raise fuel duty and say that's going to pay for subsidies on electric cars, for example, or that's going to pay for electric charging point network infrastructure all around the country. Something that would actually, you know, make a difference. But anyway, we need to move on. I'm going to answer Karen's question. We're going to talk about some good news. Da, da, da. The poor get to eat like kings from now on, because the shutdown of restaurants, lockdown, the problems with the hospitality sector, all those posh 5-star Michelin-starred restaurants in London, they haven't been able to feed the fat rich people all the venison. So there's 34 tons of it going begging, and it's going out via the Country Food Trust to food banks and charities. So I am looking forward, Dan, to getting questions on. Maybe we should do a Facebook Live about how to cook venison, because I haven't got a clue. If any came my way. Well, but this is good. Surely this means there's a modern day Robin Hood going out feeding the poor with deer that have been stolen from the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Well, I've never cooked venison either, because, you know, it's a bit dear, isn't it? I don't mean to ruin the good news or anything, but there's a slightly serious point here, is that if we don't cook it, it means millions of other people aren't going to know how to cook it either. So actually the benefit of getting it from a food bank is maybe not going to be fantastic, especially if you need to switch the oven on for 2 hours to do it, but you know, which all costs money. But you know, better than no food at all, I suppose. But
exactly. I suggest people Google that. If they end up having to get some venison in their plates, they Google it and see the best way to cook it. I have managed to eat it once or twice when someone else was paying, I should add, and it's very tasty. It seems very nutritious, so it's probably a good thing to be eating.
Lean, isn't it? Very lean.
Very lean, exactly.
BBC Good Food has been my go-to in lockdown. I know I should probably plug some Mirror. Do we have recipes? I don't think so. But,
we don't have recipes. Maybe we'll come up with some. I'll do a special venison Facebook Live. How to eat
you can search by I've got carrots. What can I cook on BBC? And it's like carrot recipes, and they've got 30 recipes with carrots. It's brilliant. Love it.
There you go, a little insight into Dan's evenings at home. Thanks for watching, everybody. We hope we've answered your questions about the budget. If there's any more, then keep following us on Twitter. There will be more stuff, I'm sure, from Dan today as he goes through some of the big stuff or the small print that's hidden away in there in the budget. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you again on the news agenda next Monday. Have a nice weekend.